program tonight. My name is Rachel, and I am part of the NHE staff here at Bon Echo, and that stands for Natural Heritage Education. So tonight, we're very, very fortunate because the Friends of Bon Echo have made it possible to have Ian and Margaret Axford here, and they are some local experts on some of the early settlement history of the area. So Margaret here is going to give a talk, and we have Ian on tech support in the back. They're going to talk a little bit about the area that you're in right now before it was Bon Echo Provincial Park. So without further ado, Margaret Axford.
It's a pleasure to be here to talk about the history of Bon Echo. It's my contention that these three, Weston Price, the builder, Flora MacDonald Denison, the Whitmanite, and Merrill Denison, the writer, and their very specific beliefs molded the place we know as Bon Echo. Let's go back first to the 1880s and 90s. Who owned this land around us? It didn't look anything like it does today. Thomas Tapping, for whom the bay and landing are named, owned at least 3 of the inland lots. Catherine Meeks, with her father Denison Meeks, owned several of the water lots. And Denison Meeks, by the way, was one of the 5 or 6 original settlers in the Cloyne area. David Weiss, another early settler, owned at least a lot or 2 as well. These were farming lots. Folks were here for the land, not the view. Survival was their main concern, not tourism as we know it today. Farmers' produce and animals had sustained the loggers from the mid-1800s to now the late 1880s, and by that time settlers were beginning to arrive. Being brought north from the front, meaning Napanee and Belleville and places like that, along the Addington Road. It's really hard for us to understand what life would have been like here in 1880. But suffice it to say that their very survival depended on hard work on the part of the whole family, and sometimes we wonder why they had 10 children. They needed the help. And basic foods, things that could be grown in a garden, caught in the lake, or shot in the woods. I've decided that there were no food allergies in 1880 and no vegans either. The area had no specific name then. The lake was known as Missionaug or Massanog. If you were Janie Weiss, daughter of David Weiss, you just called it Our Lake. Fortunately, we have the memoirs of Janie Weiss to draw on. They are invaluable documents for getting a picture of these fascinating times. And now to the builder, Dr. Weston Price. When Weston Andrew Vallow Price and his bride, Florence Anthony, came paddling up Massanog Lake from the south in the summer of 1898 on their honeymoon, little did they know what they were about to set in motion. Price was a dentist in Cleveland, but his birthplace was in Newburgh, Ontario, just north and east of Napanee, not very far away. And so how did he get from Newburgh to Lake Massanog? From the memoirs of Janie Weiss, we learn that her father David had given permission to a group of college boys to camp on his property, one of whom was Weston Price. These were probably the first campers. Dr. Price's background is of interest. The Price and Vallow families in Newburgh were extensive. One of his cousins was Marie Vallow, who became a well-known actress who made her debut in New York City in 1893. Mrs. Price, the former Florence Anthony, had been born in Brampton, Ontario, and at the time of their marriage was teaching school in Ardoch, which is just east of here. There are large Price and family files in the Lennox and Addington County Archives in Napanee. Anecdotal evidence tells of large numbers still in existence. Weston himself had 9 or 10 siblings. And so these two canoeists had a fair bit of history, of Eastern Ontario experience, rather. So very shortly after they arrived at the Narrows, as we know it now, they began to think of acquiring some land. Who wouldn't, even in 1898? They made inquiries and found out who owned what. Over the following winter, deals were made that were necessary to purchase the land. And when they returned next summer, in 1899, Weston Price set about to build an inn in the style of the large inns found in the Adirondacks, tourist hotels patronized by wealthy Americans who wanted to experience the wilderness for their holiday, as long as the wilderness had comfortable beds and good meals. He knew that the setting of the rock would be a natural draw, so he began to build the inn using local labor. The name Bon Echo, by the way, was given to the area by the Prices. So the focus of the property changed at this point from farming, as it had been, to the view. And so thus tourism in Land O'Lakes was born. Not only did Dr. Price have lots of local labor to draw on, since timbering had waned in recent years, but he also had a good quantity of building material left behind by the loggers. Merrill Denison, whom we will meet a little bit later in my talk, describes Price as being a small, wiry man, always rushing somewhere with a hammer in his hand. Given the amount that was accomplished during the spring and summer of 1899 and 1900, we can surmise that he was indeed productive. He was also determined. There were setbacks, as there are in any building project, but one of Price's setbacks was significant. The frame of the main building had been built, but it fell in when a high wind came roaring down the lake from the north. There had not been proper bracing. No matter, let's start again. So in 2 summers, Price and his workers had constructed the main building, which you see there, 5 cottages, a separate staff house, a boat house, a laundry, an ice house, a water tower, docks, a bridge across the Narrows, and an iron staircase up the face and to the top of the rock. 2 summers. In 1901, a telephone wire was strung from Calidar Station up the Addington Road to the inn, long before any telephone existed anywhere else in the area. This was a man with a vision. There was even a Bon Echo telephone company. And if you have not read Merrill Denison's account called Early Days at Bon Echo in the local history book called The Oxen and the Axe, I would urge you to do so. The amount of detail is very impressive and is more than I certainly have time and opportunity, perhaps, to communicate with you tonight. Price was a teetotaler, so the inn was dry, a situation that remained until Merrill took over. We know that he was also a religious man. The account which I just mentioned from The Oxen and the Axe tells of one Sunday during the 1901 visit of the Denison family when Dr. Price found 8-year-old Merrill playing solitaire in the loft of the boathouse when he should have been at the Sunday service in the living room. Presumably, Dr. Price was not pleased. Merrill describes the kind of customer the Prices were looking for as religiously minded nature lovers like themselves. Janie Weiss, in her comments about Bon Echo, commends Price for employing her father and her brothers and for buying produce from their farm. She specifically mentions eggs, butter, milk, cream, and chickens. As far as Janie was concerned, quote, "My oldest brother Tommy and Dad built a 3-story hotel with 50 rooms, a big living room and dining room and kitchen on the first floor," unquote. I think that Tommy and Dad might have had a little help. And so we begin to have a glimpse into the kind of people the Prices were and the sort of place they envisioned. An obituary for Florence provides us with a picture of the life of this couple after their Bon Echo days. Price was a very well-known dentist in Cleveland and beyond. The couple did significant research around the world among primitive peoples, studying their nutrition, their health and physical fitness, from which Dr. Price wrote many articles. Mrs. Price was also heavily involved in her church and in various good works in Cleveland, but in her obituary, unfortunately, there are no references to her son or to their days at Bon Echo. Now, Flora MacDonald Denison enters the Bon Echo picture first in 1901, on the trip which Merrill describes in The Oxen and the Axe. She's accompanied by Merrill, of course, but also by her husband, Howard Denison. He doesn't stay in the picture very long, but in 1901 he is there. The 3 stay in the Royal Suite, the Tower Room. which had such a magnificent view of the rock. Flora's inclination was, of course, to buy the whole place right then and there, but Price wasn't selling. She had to content herself with a lot south of the Narrows, which she purchased from Catherine Meeks and her father. The exact location of that lot is uncertain. The Denisons were to spend the next 9 summers at the lake in a cottage built on that lot. There's much research to be done on the ownership throughout the years of those lake lots. Anyone who would like to do that research, or at the very least help with it, can see me later. Even though we're not quite finished with Weston Price, let's stop for a moment and have a preliminary look at this second shaper of Bon Echo. Flora MacDonald Denison was a fascinating woman. Her birth in 1867 is always referred to as happening in the midst of a raging February blizzard in a log shanty on the Bridgewater Road, 2 miles north of what is now known as Actinolite. Her mother was Elizabeth Thompson. Her father, of United Empire Loyalist stock, was George Merrill, a teacher and principal for many years in Prince Edward County. Mr. Merrill made the mistake of letting himself be talked into a mining venture, which Bill of Flint, senator and founder of Flinton, was promoting, the North Hastings bronze mine. Mr. Merrill obviously didn't know that bronze isn't mined and lost his money, much of which had been his wife's. She had inherited a farm in Prince Edward County, 200 acres valued at $12,000, which had to be sold to cover George's worthless mining investment. History doesn't tell us how much Senator Flint gained from that transaction. The members of the Merrill family then had to do what they could to try to make some money. Flora taught school for a year or two in the French settlement between Actinolite and Flinton when she was 19 or 20. Then she headed to Toronto, where she became a dressmaker in the women's department at Robert Simpson's department store, and subsequently became the manager of that department. It was her work at Simpson's which fanned the flames of her interest in human rights. The company installed a punch clock system where employees had to punch in and out daily. Seeing this as an infringement on employee honesty, Flora quit. It appears that there were lots of jobs in her chosen field of dressmaking, or modiste, as a Simpsons ad called it. In 1892, while doing some work in the U.S., she met and married Howard Denison, a divorced father of 3 children who lived with their mother. Arthur, one of the 3, was to become involved with Bon Echo at one point later on, and he and Merrill seem to have had a friendly relationship. Merrill was born a year later in 1893 in the U.S. because his mother wanted her son to be an American as well as a Canadian citizen. Hence the name Mugwump, which Merrill often called himself, someone with his mug in one country and his wump in the other. During her working years, Flora started to write, in particular about women's rights. She wrote columns on women's suffrage for the Sunday World newspaper in Toronto and became one of the leading figures in the worldwide suffrage movement, with speaking engagements in the US and in Europe. I'm always astonished at how much traveling people did in this time period. A trip to Europe would not have been a 5 or 6 hour commitment. In 1910, on the family's annual trip to the lake, Flora discovered that Weston Price was ready to sell his Bon Echo land. Now here's a bit of an enigma. The story that we hear most often is that the Prices were selling because their 10-year-old son had died. Even Merrill tells us that the Prices operated Bon Echo Inn until 1910 when they, quote, sold it to my mother shortly after the death of Donald, their only child. In fact, Donald Weston Price didn't die until 1914, when he was 15 years of age. The family files in the Lennox and Addington archives in Napanee are quite clear about that. John Campbell, in the book The Mazenod Experience, says that at the time of the sale, Donald was ill and was to die later of spinal meningitis. Janie Weiss tells of the young Price diving into the waters of Lake Mazenod, hitting his head on a rock and never recovering, and perhaps she was right. At any rate, the Prices were anxious to sell and return to Cleveland, and Flora was anxious to buy. Now, I would like you to imagine how much property around here you think you could buy with $13,000, even if you lived 100 years ago. For $13,000, Flora acquired the inn and the adjoining property from the Prices. Now, the lots that we're talking about here, basically what we're talking about, follow the red dot, my friends, and it will show you everything from what is now the access at Tapping's Landing on both sides of the water there to about where the dot is. A huge amount of land, including Big Bear Island up in Lake Mazenau at the corner of Campbell's Bay, right in there, and another, and lot 42 in Range B east of the Addington Road. So a huge amount of land for $13,000. Of course, now it's priceless. There's, it should be part of the MasterCard ad. The purchase appears to have been joint between Flora and Howard, as his name is on the original deed with Flora's. And I suspect that it was Howard who put up the money. Howard even managed the inn from 1911 to 1913, before the two separated. However, the copy of the land transfer which we have in the museum has the name of Howard Denison crossed out. I guess that's a sign, if there ever was one, that the marriage was finished. And so Flora found herself in the inn business. For her, the inn was to be a haven for artists, philosophers, and other intellectual giants. She wanted to provide them with the luxuries of an inn in the midst of nature, exemplified by the grandeur of Mazenau Rock. There they could, according to her, and this is a quote, renew their souls, their energies, and their creative instincts, basking in the sun and breezes and in the lingering spirit of Walt Whitman. She wanted to celebrate and spread the teachings and writings of Walt Whitman, who was the famous American poet of the early 1800s. Flora had been caught up with his democratic ideals, seeing Bon Echo as a symbol of democratic freedom. For her, the beauty of Bon Echo would always be enhanced by the spirit of Walt Whitman. She quotes a line from one of Whitman's poems to sum up her vision in her publication, The Sunset of Bon Echo. Did you think that the sunset was for you and not for him or her? Today we might use the word inclusive, meaning for everyone. Flora used the word democratic. When people come into the museum to talk to have a look at what we have there, they always want to know when Whitman came to Bon Echo. Well, he never did. Flora had become familiar with his writings before this time period. He was dead by the time that Flora was here. In addition to her devotion to Whitman, Flora was a spiritualist, meaning that she felt she could talk to the dead. Now, spiritualism was a very popular movement in Ontario and Upper New York State, beginning in the mid-1800s. It became increasingly popular during the war years as family members found it comforting to be able to speak with their dead sons. Stan McMullen, who was a former Friends of Bon Echo board member, has published a book entitled Anatomy of a Seance, in which he explores the history of this movement. It would be impossible for me to try to describe the movement to you in a couple of minutes. Suffice it to say that Flora was an adherent and participated in many seances. In her magazine, The Sunset of Bon Echo, Flora talks about communicating with Walt Whitman. An example of the experience of Horace Traubel, one of Whitman's biographers, might help you to see what the spiritualists were about. And the very frail-looking man in the middle, is Horace Traubel. Traubel, an old man and in poor health at the time, was in residence at Bon Echo when he is reported to have heard Walt's voice calling to him to come on. He also saw Whitman in a vision. Just over the rock, he says, Walt appeared in a golden glory, brilliant and splendid. And within a few days, Horace was dead. Horace Traubel was an important man of the time. He had been a literary secretary for Whitman, and as I mentioned, one of his biographers. Now, this sounds like a contradiction in terms, but the story of Horace's death is too good not to tell. Horace, who had come to Bon Echo for the dedication of the carving on Mazenod Rock, called Old Walt, died at Bon Echo in September 1919. Now, a casket was necessary to transport the body back to New Jersey, where he had been living. Fortunately, a man named Holly Stone, who lived in Flinton, sold caskets. So Flora took it upon herself to drive to Flinton to buy a casket. A team of horses and a democrat, or wagon, were dispatched to pick up the casket, return with it to Bon Echo, where Horace's body was placed in the casket, and then team and casket with Flora and Horace's wife Anne set off for Caladar to catch the 2 a.m. train to Montreal. All this in the midst of driving rain and high winds over the still very rough Addington Road. And there's also mention of St. Elmo's fire, or balls of lightning on the Caladar Hills. Must have been quite an evening. In Montreal, Horace's body was embalmed and placed in a proper oak casket with elegantly carved scroll corners. Now, I suspect that Holly Stone's casket became kindling. 2 days later, Horace's body was shipped yet again by train to New Jersey. Now, Horace had not been a religious man. As a matter of fact, just the opposite. And he did not want to be buried from a church. He made this known to both Flora and to his wife. His body was taken, however, under protestations to a community church. Much negotiation ensued, but Anne's wishes finally prevailed, and she moved the service to a public auditorium not far away. While Flora is gathering up the flowers to move them to the new location of the service, the church bursts into flames. Horace's casket and the fire trucks that arrive at approximately the same time. The move to the auditorium is finally accomplished, and calm prevails. So in the end, Horace had his way and was not buried from a church. Now, you can take whatever you like from the fire that broke out in the church. Without further drama, he was taken to the Harley Cemetery in Camden, New Jersey, where he was buried not far from his mentor, Walt Whitman. A student of Bon Echo asked an interesting question, which is quoted in the book Walt Whitman's Canada. Can there have been many well-to-do Canadians in those days who preferred a séance at midnight to Sunday morning service? His answer to himself, Bon Echo guests were a special breed. The issue of Flora's spiritualism caused all sorts of interest among local people here, as I think you can probably imagine. There was whispering about what nefarious things might be going on at Bon Echo, with talk of the windows being blacked out against curious eyes. Seances might have been the in thing for the well-to-do in the cities, not in Cloyne. During the time period from 1913 to 1920, the inn was host to a number of famous visitors. American author James Thurber, Canadian author Morley Callahan, the American architect Frank Lloyd Wright, who came up with a few suggestions for expanding the inn, but these would have been far too expensive to even consider. There are, of course, many things to be said about Flora. While she ran her own dressmaking business before coming to Bon Echo, including in Napanee, she doesn't seem to have been able to run the inn as a successful business. In her letters to Merrill, she talks a great deal about the need for money. Her dreams seem to have outstretched her financial capabilities. For example, in her plans for the Bon Echo property was a Whitman library, which she saw as having thousands of books about Whitman and other writers whom she admired. The sod for the library was turned by Horace Trauble shortly before his death, and there is mention of a cornerstone carved by a man named George Morris of Buffalo, New York. But no building ever materialized. Now, has anyone seen an unattached cornerstone lurking around the visitor center? The dedication of the Whitman inscription on the rock was to be a splendid tribute to the spirit of Walt Whitman. The quotation, "My foothold is tendon and mortised in granite," I laugh at what you call dissolution, and I know the amplitude of time, is from Whitman's best-known book of poems called Leaves of Grass. Without money yet again, Flora was able to persuade one of her Toronto friends to bankroll her for the inscription, which was done by 2 Scottish stone carvers brought over especially for the job. Today, we cringe at the thought of defacing the rock in this way. In 1919, there were no such concerns. Flora only ran Bon Echo for about 7 years before her death in 1921 at the age of 54. Her enthusiastic espousal of the ideals of an American poet, her activities in the cause of women's suffrage, her spiritualism, all come together to make a remarkable person for her time period. There is no one who could have loved Bon Echo more fervently than did Flora MacDonald Denison. Flora died on May the 23rd, 1921. Her body was sent to Buffalo to be cremated because at that time it was illegal to cremate bodies in Toronto. Her ashes were placed in a bronze urn, any irony there, and transported back to Ontario, where they were dropped into Lake Mazenau at the base of the inscription to Old Walt, and where presumably they still lie. And so to the third builder of Bon Echo. After his mother's death, Merrill found himself the owner of 10 square miles of forest and water, plus an inn, which was badly in need of repairs and refurbishment. Merrill had trained as an architect, and so he knew what needed to be done, but there was always too little money. Like his mother, however, Merrill had more than a passing interest in writing, and it was this occupation that was to sustain him for the rest of his life. His dramatic and artistic contacts came about when he was asked by the director of Hart House Theatre in Toronto to come into the theatre as an art director. This meant that he was a stage designer, did some acting, and started to write. His first play, Brothers in Arms, was a huge success, having been performed hundreds of times, including here at Bon Echo, in the Playhouse in Tweed, and at North Addington Education Centre in Cloyne. Being a writer meant that he could frequent the Arts and Letters Club, a venerable Canadian institution in Toronto, where his photo hangs with those of A.Y. Jackson, Arthur Lismer, other members of the Group of Seven, as well as many of the literary giants of this country. But first, there was the inn. Merrill was a much more pragmatic person than his mother, and realized soon enough the perils of trying to profitably run a summer resort. He had a mere 8 weeks in the summer in which to make money. The access roads to the inn left much to be desired. The infrastructure was failing. There was no electricity. There were boats which needed constant repairs, and guests who could be both demanding and difficult. Now, to give him a lot of credit, he pitched in where others would have just walked away. He tackled the plumbing, the repairs, the coddling of guests. But the person who really saved the day was Muriel Goggin, a woman whom Merrill had met at Hart House and was perfectly capable of running Bon Echo Inn. From about 1922 to 1928, they ran the inn together, or at least Muriel ran it. She cleaned, redecorated, hired staff, and ran the place like a general. She was constantly admonishing Merrill for spending money they didn't have, or which should have gone into their marriage fund. They finally did marry in 1926, although there was still not much money. Muriel eventually understood that Merrill was better off writing, and she was consequently better off managing. What would have happened without Muriel is pretty obvious. And under her guidance, the inn prospered until the stock market crash in 1929 meant that no wealthy patrons were spending their holidays in a place like Bon Echo Inn, if they were having holidays at all. The inn was not dark in the 30s, though. Merrill had rented the inn and the property to a private school, Trinity College School in Port Hope. Many of the boarders were boys whose parents were quite pleased to ship them off to camp for the summer to be under the direction of the staff who had taught them throughout the year. We met one of these boarders about 5 or 6 years ago, a man then in his 90s, whose memory was failing him, but who kept saying that those 4 years were the best of his life. One of the prized possessions of the museum is a miniature riding crop which he had won in the horse races of 1929, with the date and his name engraved on it. And what was this camp called? Well, Camp Mazenod, of course. Not to be confused with the Camp Mazenod, which began in 1940, formed by a group of educators from East York and Toronto. So from 1929 to 1934 or 5, the inn resounded with the sounds of campers. The museum has a 2 or 3 minute video clip of bathing suitless little boys jumping into the lake from a tall diving tower. This was the first Camp Mazenod. During this time, Merrill was concentrating more and more on his writing, which at this point included several short stories and plays. The plays were published together in 1923 under the title The Unheroic North, the success of which has caused him to be called Canada's first playwright. He was writing columns for the Star Weekly and other magazines. He was also developing his conservationist voice. As a boy, he had clearly seen the effects of the big timber companies on the area around Bon Echo, the mess their teams left behind, the devastation of the fires, and the effects on the local economy of the pulling out of those timber companies. It's only really when you see a picture like that, and when you know what that looks like now, that you can actually see the devastation of those fires. Local farmers no longer had a market for their produce. There was no winter employment, and so people gradually either moved away or drifted into unemployment and poverty. Merrill saw this happening. He wrote for the Star Weekly about these conditions, railing against governments who ignored these people in favor of well-to-do farmers and townspeople in the southern part of the counties. He pointed to countries in Europe whose governments had ensured that forests and woodlands were replanted, and eventually his rantings were heard. Merrill served as an unpaid advisor for the Department of Lands and Forests for a time. He was trying to talk the ministry into turning Bon Echo into a research center for forestry practices. Eventually, the ministry apparently preferred Algonquin Park, where such a center was set up at Dorset. And then in 1936, the inn burned. That year, the property had been rented to the Levins brothers, whose family still has a cottage on the Upper Mazenod. They also ran a flying school north of Toronto. In the summer of 1936, there had been visitors to the inn, including a man and his son who were still there the night of the fire in September and had to jump from their rooms to safety. The cause was attributed to a lightning strike. Several years ago, my husband and I interviewed a woman who had been employed at the inn in 1936. Then she was a Toronto girl, 16 years old, who was determined that she was not going back to the city to school, but instead would stay at the inn and continue to make some money to send back to her mother, who was managing on her own as a widow. This young woman and her boyfriend and an older man had been at a dance that night at Salmon's Resort on Mississauga Lake, now Lancasters. As they drove up the Addington Road to return to the inn, they could see the red glow in the sky and feared the worst. Standing watching the inn burn, her tears flowed. A man came up to her and pressed a $5 bill into her hand, telling her that that was all he had, or he would have given her more. One has to wonder who that man was. The loss of the job was significant in her life, but also up in smoke was a brand new winter outfit which she had purchased at Spencer's store in Cloyne a short time before the fire. Some of you will recognize this as being Grand's. The building still stands. This was a very poignant first-hand interview of someone who witnessed a significant moment in the history of this area, an opportunity which comes along infrequently. So what was Merrill's future without the inn? Well, there was no talk of rebuilding it with an inadequate insurance policy. Friends of the Denisons were often seen at the property, coming to the lake for holidays in one of the cabins not touched by the fire. Meanwhile, both Merrill and Muriel pursued their writing careers. Merrill's office was in what is now Greystones, his desk in front of the window looking out on the rock. Nice spot for an office. This, by the way, is a photo of by the famous Canadian Joseph Karsh, just one of those famous visitors to Bon Echo. Merrill wrote a series of books about a young girl called Susanna, some of whose experiences were loosely based on Muriel's own life. These became very popular, with the first one, just called Susanna, being turned into a movie by 20th Century Fox, starring Shirley Temple, her last film as a child actress. One of the major efforts which came from Merrill's pen in the 1930s was a radio series called Romance of Canada, produced at Merrill's urging by Tyrone Guthrie, who is perhaps better known to us as one of the first British actors to appear on stage at the Stratford Shakespearean Festival in Stratford, Ontario. As a result of this series, Merrill produced a similar one in America, entitled Great Moments in History. Merrill's career in radio was astounding and for the most part is not well known. Throughout the 1940s and 50s, Merrill's fame and accomplishments continued to grow. In 1943, he published Klondike Mike, which is a huge success, becoming a Book of the Month Club publication. He continued his work in radio, both in the US and Canada, and then he took to writing corporate histories. In 1956, he published The Power to Go, which was the story of the automobile industry. Harvest Triumphant was the 100-year story of Massey Harris. The Barley in the Stream was funded by Molson's. The People's Power, Ontario Hydro's story. Canada's First Bank, the history of the Bank of Montreal, which took him 12 years to complete. Interestingly, the Ontario Hydro story was written at Greystones by the light of coal oil lamps. By the early 1950s, when Merrill was doing all this writing, he hired Mary Savigny, whom some of you may remember. Mary became Merrill's secretary, but also a general helper to him. Mary's book, called Bon Echo, The Denison Years, has a very interesting account of the life around Bon Echo. Even though Merrill was beginning to see profits from his writing, money was still an issue. His tax bill, as you can imagine, was extraordinary. Both Mary Savigny and her husband John, who had become good friends with Merrill, urged him to sell some of his property. Big Bear Island, which was one piece of the package purchased by Flora, was sold for $2,200. John Savigny, who had wisely obtained his real estate broker's license, prepared and sold 25 parcels of land. Retained by Merrill was approximately 100 acres that surrounded the inn. And so I would guess that some of you have properties once owned by Flora MacDonald Denison and sold by John Savigny as agent for Merrill. Throughout these years, Merrill was still spending June through September at Bon Echo. His health had started to deteriorate, assisted by his refusal to give up smoking and scotch. Must have been the smoking that did it, right? However, he had not given up on his aspirations for Bon Echo, that the environment should be preserved. He continued to talk to the province of Ontario about Bon Echo being, quote, a meeting place, as it was for the Algonquins, a center to which people would come to learn, to discuss ideas in natural surroundings. He saw facilities for sleeping, eating, recreation, meeting rooms. Quote, our aim should be to attract any and all groups concerned with the betterment of democratic institutions and the democratic way of life. And you can hear his mother's voice in those words. However, with frustration about the lack of enthusiasm from the provincial representatives, Merrill began to realize that his dream of a cultural center at Bon Echo was going to be just that. And so he formally turned over the land to the province for use as a provincial park in 1959, although the public ceremony didn't take place until 1965, and you see him here. He is said to have expressed horror at the concept of becoming a tenant of Queen Elizabeth II, not quite what the good Democrat, raised within the songs of that ultra-Democrat Walt Whitman, could ever have wanted. Muriel Goggin Denison died in 1954. In 1957, Merrill married Elizabeth Andrew, known as Lisa. Merrill and Lisa continued to use Dollywood and Greystones, but by the 1970s, Merrill's health was declining further. In 1974, he had a fainting spell while at a party on the lake, on MacDonald Lake at the Brummel Cottage. And this photograph is of their trip across the lake to the gathering, which would be Merrill's last occasion on the lake. He had to be taken by boat to Leicester's Marina, now Smarts, and then by ambulance to Belleville General Hospital. He spent another brief time in Montreal, then Lisa moved him to the U.S. Army Veterans Hospital in La Jolla, California, where she had recently bought a house. He suffered a stroke on June the 12th, 1975, and died alone. Merrill Denison was 81. His legacy to Bon Echo is, of course, the park itself, an overwhelming gift for a conservationist to make. However, Merrill's insistence on the importance of the arts within the context of the natural beauty of Bon Echo is another facet of his legacy and is shown clearly in his plays and in his support for painters, including the Group of Seven. The legacy of all three, Weston Price, Flora MacDonald Denison, and Merrill Denison, is that the democratic spirit should prevail. The ordinary person must continue to have access to this wonderful place. Thank you.